So our final lesson on the consensus theories of society, focusing on functionalist views, we evaluated this idea. So again, we need to know the consensus views of society and think about the problems that they may present in terms of our understanding. We need to explain these criticisms using the theoretical views of both internal and external critiques, and then also consider opposing theorists' views and how they kind of mend this idea where they see fault in the consensus theories of society. So we started off by playing consensus theory bingo based on the keywords that we've learnt, and I think you were pretty good and very competitive at remembering these words, particularly structural differentiation. So the first criticism that we looked at of consensus theory of society was Merton's criticism. Remember that we can make links to crime and deviance here, and Merton, as you know, came up with the idea of strain theory. But as a functionalist, Merton criticised this view of society in asking, is society always functional? Are there sometimes issues and things that we face that are not functional, that don't help society, they don't help us to maintain social solidarity? So remember, Merton talks about the idea that there isn't always a functional meaning of crime. So sometimes there's a manifest and sometimes there's a latent theory of crime and criminal acts. Also, are the consequences of change always intended? So what we actually try and set out to do, does it always cause a consequence that's intended? So we might actually intend to do one thing, but it actually might cause another. Also, action might not be intentional, it might just happen as a result of the situation. And so people might actually act and a different outcome may occur as a result. In terms of external critique, you have Sharrock et al. So these people are not functionalists, they actually take a different approach to this. And they question again, is everyone in agreement? Do people just carry on regardless? Do they accept their passive roles? Or do they disagree with what people say? Is society really like an organism? Do things evolve over time, or do they actually happen as a result of conflict, things that happen in immediacy and people responding to those things? Does society slowly evolve without the intervention of a leader? If we're saying that society is like an organic being, then that would suggest that it evolves gently and slowly over time. But actually, maybe we need the intervention of a leader, maybe we don't need the intervention of a leader, and this is what it's questioning. And in this case, this is more of a Marxist, a conflict theory of society. A Marxist perspective is suggesting that maybe we don't need a leader, maybe we don't need someone, we don't need, according to Marxists, the agencies to help us to evolve. And finally, are people passive recipients or observers of change, or do they take an active part in it? So we can actually look at this from an interpretivist perspective, where we say that people are not passive recipients of things. They don't just accept things, they actually make informed decisions based on the situation and based on their prior experiences too. So in terms of looking at internal criticisms, we actually looked at how Merton questioned Parsons in asking, is society always functional, and are the consequences of change always intended? So we actually looked at a Merton versus Parsons document here. And so we have Parsons, who says that religion, education and the nuclear family are vital for the function of society, and also that every system is interdependent, so the malfunction of one would cause an anomic state. Then we have the idea that Merton has, is that actually society can function without institutions. So we see people who are part of single parent families who function very well, and the children are well socialised and they're happy, and actually this is something that Parsons would reject. If we look at this comment as well, where many parts of society are interdependent, which another word for that is autonomous, where people often change. So sometimes something is separated from society. You can't clearly make a link between one thing and another, that idea of cause and effect. So for instance, there isn't a link between people who are unemployed and people producing a wildlife documentary. unless they were producing the wildlife documentary to raise employment, but that wouldn't happen. So sometimes things are autonomous, they are independent of other things, and so society, it could be argued, according to Merton, that not everything is interdependent. We don't have an anime where those autonomous actions happen. Parsons argued that everyone has a function or a role to maintain, but Merton questions this by saying sometimes dysfunction has no function, because not everyone agrees with what is functional. So some people might agree that a single parent family is functional, but other people may not. And the example that we give here is the idea that there can be a conflict of interest between institutions and other groups within society, where certainly until recently the Christian Church has said that gay people getting married is inappropriate and it goes against religious teachings, and so there's been a conflict there, and so there's kind of no clear function of what's going on in this situation. So as a functionalist, Merton questions his fellow functionalist Parsons. So in terms of looking at an external critique, we actually looked through all of these slides, and I'm going to speak to you about these now, but they're quite complicated, and certainly we spent a lot of time discussing them. So in terms of external factors, we looked at whether there is always a cause and effect. So we questioned, do things always exist as a result of their function? So the function of a family is to socialise children. Does that mean that a child came along and then a family evolved around it and created around it, so the child caused the family to form? Or could it possibly be that it's the other way around? That a family forms and then children come as a result. So a functionalist would have us believe that the need to socialise children is the cause of our family, or the effect is that a family is created. And we've been questioning this in saying that actually sometimes children in the past were economic assets where they would work with their families, but now people want to develop their families. Sometimes people adopt, sometimes they have their biological children, but certainly external critiques would argue that the family came first. External critique is from a scientific approach. So whilst functionalists believe that they take a scientific approach, they do like quantitative methods to measure society. Scientific approaches have criticised this in using Popper's idea of proving or disproving the existence of black swans. Now, you all said that you didn't think the black swans existed, but they do. All you need to do is see one black swan to prove that actually they do in fact exist. And proving something is dysfunctional and functional, you cannot take a scientific approach to this because it's someone's experience. So in terms of looking at the scientific approach, it would only take one example to prove or disprove an idea. However, you can't apply that same scientific approach to measuring people's thoughts and reactions in society. In terms of the Marxist approach, Marxists question whether everything in society is actually cohesive, questioning if everything does change organically. So they're asking, is change something that happens slowly over time, or is it actually something that happens as a result of conflict? So thinking about the students' riots, where they coped with changes in tuition fees, so they actually ended up rioting. Here we go, so here's a picture of them, and so the immediate change that happened created a mini revolution, sadly unsuccessful, but something that did happen as a result of immediate change. And so if we're saying that society evolves slowly over time, how do we see communities coping with immediate change like earthquakes, terrorist attacks, bushfires in Australia? So Marxists would critique this idea of consensus theory in that actually sometimes change happens quickly, and yes, we do see examples of anime, but society does cope and change with this, which goes against the functionalist idea that things happen slowly and organically. Our final one is the idea of postmodernity. So can society really be cohesive? Or in a postmodernist world or view, is that we have such a fragmented society that we don't really need cohesion anymore, and it can never really be completely cohesive because there are so many choices, fragments and options within society. Media is fragmented, the choices that we have in media, the types of media that we experience, all fragmented. People are diverse, they make their own choices, there is infinite choice, there is no limit to what kind of things we choose and how much choice they have, and often people live in a world of hyper-reality where it's actually quite difficult to distinguish between fiction and reality. We can take things like Facebook, YouTube, things like Instagram and WhatsApp and other social media sites where people communicate and socialise through those things. It's very difficult to track and monitor. It's very difficult to see how people are cohesive within the real world in society, because things are just so disjointed. And the final critique was the idea that is an interactionist or interpretivist idea that the structuralist theories are just always too deterministic. So one thing doesn't always determine our actions. According to structuralist theories like consensus theories, society determines all of our actions, and actually interactionists would disagree. They would ask about free will and people choosing not to fulfill their roles, the idea that people have a choice about the roles that they would like to perform and how they perform them. So here are two examples that you could try in response to the idea of consensus theories of society, and that is our final lesson on consensus theory.